Hello everyone, this is Evolution 5 Plus. This is a part that we didn't get to talk about when we first started learning about evolution. This is the evidence for evolution. How do we know evolution exists? How do we know evolution is real? So there are 5 categories that you should remember. The first one is direct observation. We can actually see evolution happening nowadays all the time. And I'll talk about it. And there's molecular biology, something inside your body that can tell us that evolution is happening or has happened and is happening at the same time. There is the anatomy, so kind of the body structures, bone structures, and all that of different organisms. And fossils, we can observe fossils, and biogeography. So let's talk about it one at a time, starting with direct observation. So as an example right here, so direct observation means we can actually detect evolution happening right now. So right here is an example that happened in the 50s where there was a lot of use of pesticides, and what we saw was that at the beginning there were some mosquitoes that were resistant to pesticides, meaning that they cannot be killed by the pesticides. So what happened was when we sprayed pesticides onto these mosquitoes, a few of those mosquitoes survived because they have genes that allow them to be resistant to the pesticides. They cannot be killed. So then the result is we killed all of the mosquitoes that are not resistant to the pesticides, which seemed like a good thing at the beginning. But then after a while, those resistant mosquitoes were able to survive and reproduce. And then all we have left are mosquitoes that are very resistant to the pesticides. So we can no longer use it because they're not very effective anymore. So this process, remember, evolution is the change in allele frequencies over time. And change in allele frequencies can lead to change in characteristics. So right here, there's a change in the characteristic, right? The change in the ability to survive of the mosquitoes. But ultimately, this difference in resistance versus non-resistant, those came from the genes. So there's a change in allele frequencies from this population to this population as well. And if you can remember the peppered moth game that you played one time, there was the initial where there are a lot of pepper moths that are lighter, but then after the industrial revolution, there were a lot more dark pepper moth as a result of the natural selection process. So that change in allele frequencies, we can actually detect it right now. And at the Galapagos Island as well, there were experiments done over there, as we saw in the video that one time. There were changes in the finches' beaks before and after the droughts. Remember? So now, the second one is another way that we know that evolution is happening is through molecular biology. There are several ways that we can think about it. We can talk about the DNA sequence between different organisms, right? We can see that between human and chimpanzees and other primates, for example, we can see a lot of DNA similarities, and between us and even a fly and fruits and bacteria, there are still DNA sequences that are similar to each other. And depending on how similar the DNA sequence is or not, you can tell how closely related different species are. So DNA sequence, we said evolution is change in allele frequencies over time, right? So we can see the change in DNA sequences as well. Homologous genes are genes that are similar to each other. Now, the second one is amino acid sequence. We can also see that organisms that are closer related to each other would have amino acid sequences, or the sequence that makes proteins that are very similar to each other. We can also see that the transcription translation process are very similar. Even between us and bacteria, the transcription and translation process are very similar, and we're using the same codes. The DNA always has ATCG. RNA always have AUCG. And the amino acid, we always read the same universal codon chart. We develop the codon chart based on how translation happens in your body. But they all the transcription translation, they all follow the same rules. The third one is anatomy. We can obviously see a lot of similarities and differences between animals just by looking at them. So this is how you can look at two different organisms and say how closely related they are, right? And what you can see is that right here, these are called homologous structures. Homologous structures, remember, have similar structures, different functions. Again, homologous structures have similar structures, different function. Say it again. Similar structure, different functions. Okay. Analogous structures are the opposite. They have similar functions and different structures. So for example, so human and dog and birds and whales, you can see that the bone structures are very similar to each other, but they have different purposes. For human, we can grab things. For dog, they walk and they dig the dirt. Birds use their wings to fly, and whales swim. So these four structures are very similar to each other, but they have different functions. And they're similar to each other because these four organisms, or these four species, had the same common ancestor at one point. So these are called homologous structure. Analogous structures are similar functions, different structures. So for example, the wings of a bird and the wings of butterflies, those are very similar functions, right? They're all used to fly. But the wings of butterflies don't even have bones, and the wings of birds have bones, right? So what that can tell you is that those two structures have similar functions because of how the two species adapted to the environment, and not because of common ancestry. They don't have wings because their common ancestors had wings. The common ancestor of birds and butterflies do not have wings, but those wings kind of evolved on their own. It's two different branches. So homologous structures are used for as an evidence for evolution because these bone structures are similar because of evolution, and analogous structures cannot tell us about evolution because they evolved on their own. There's also homologous embryonic structures, meaning different embryos of related species look very similar to each other. So if you look at an embryo of a human versus even a snake, there are a lot of similarities between the two. Last one is called vestigial structures. Those are structures that are left over from common ancestors. So they're there because the common ancestor had them. So those structures come from somewhere. They came from the common ancestors, but they do not function anymore. So for example, this is the bottom of a type of snake, and these snakes have these vestigial legs, which means they don't use it to walk anymore, but they're left over from actual legs from the ancestor. All right, the next one is fossils. Obviously, you can compare fossils and kind of even put them into perspective on which type of ancient species was evolving and existing at one point in history, and then another one. And you can kind of line them up and see a history of how organisms evolve over time by looking at the fossils, and by looking at how similar and how different they are. So this is kind of similar to anatomical, except it's not about the anatomy of living species. The last one is biogeography. Biogeography talks about by looking at species at different continents or different locations, we can see similarities between them as a result of evolution. So for example, in the past, when the Pangea was a thing where the different continents were a lot closer to each other, organisms can move around different continents, and that allows the different species to end up on different continents. And then they go through their own evolution and become slightly different. For example, there are different types of anteaters on different continents, and they're all related to each other, and they all look very similar to each other because they all evolved from the same common ancestor that traveled to the different continents. So that's it.